Hello and good morning. My name is Emily Nemens. I am the editor of the Paris Review, but importantly for this conversation, I am the daughter of an urban planner and formerly with the American Institute of Architects, which is all to say that I've been reading Paul Goldberger's work for a very long time, and I am delighted that he has turned his attention to the baseball stadium in his new book, Ballpark. So I think a great place to start would be with the very first line,
Sure.
which is a pretty interesting one. You posit that the baseball stadium is the ultimate American metaphor. Can you explain?
Right. Well, part of that is trying to say that baseball, which is always described as a great metaphor for life, really is not, and to try to smash the myth of the baseball contains the entire meaning of life, compressed within 9 innings, but offer as a substitute the idea that the ballpark is a metaphor not for all of life. That's a little much. Nothing's a metaphor for all of life, but for a key part of American life and American culture, which is the struggle between city and country, between openness and enclosure, between agriculture and industry, between Hamilton and Jefferson, we might say. Those two ways of looking at the world, I feel are kind of brought together in the ballpark in the most amazing and very beautiful way, that it's this piece of the countryside in the city. And the two of them need each other in a wonderful and magical and almost spiritual way to function. That, a field is just a field if it's not part of the ballpark. The ballpark without the field in the middle is, of course, pointless, all the structure of it. So the two of them really need each other and depend on each other. And this wonderful sense of infinite space that exists as part of a baseball field, really. And one of the key things about baseball that makes it so different from every other team sport is that it is not played against the clock, and it's technically played in infinite space. I mean, the diamond is very precise and exact down to the inch, but the outfield goes on forever, theoretically. There's no rules about where it has to be, and it just stops where they decide to build the bleachers, or maybe it doesn't stop at all, which is why the best ballparks always are partly open, and you have this at least illusion of infinite space.
Right. Can you talk about, they were infinite for a while,
Right.
the very first wall in terms of the outfield and sort of making that space
Right.
concrete.
Well, it all kind of began, baseball first began, I guess, like most sports, as more for participants than spectators. And in the early to mid-19th century, it was transitioning into more of a spectator sport. And people would go, in New York, a lot of it was played in New York, played in a lot of places, but New York was a particularly vibrant center of it. And there were these fields with the wonderful name of the Elysian Fields in Hoboken on the Hudson River that were very popular as a baseball ground. And there were a lot of other entertainments that sprung up around it. And then this guy, William Kammerer, who was a very enterprising entrepreneur in Williamsburg, Brooklyn, and a very close friend of Boss Tweed, which is an interesting piece of information that's of no relevance to anything, had a skating rink in Williamsburg, Brooklyn, that he felt making enough money from. And he saw this, everyone was playing baseball, and people were going to watch baseball, and maybe they would pay money to watch baseball. And so he converted his skating rink into a ball field, called it Union Grounds, and had a fence and charged people 10 cents to come in and put some seating up. So that was the beginning, in my view, the first true ballpark, because it was the first place that was enclosed where you had to pay money to get in. The fence was there not to stop home run balls. It was there to stop outsiders who hadn't paid 10 cents from coming in.
Right. I think you said the center field wall was 500 feet.
I think, center field, so nobody ever hit over it anyway. It was all about just demarcating the line and the territory, as it were.
Right, but it also signaled here is a space.
Here is the space. This is the space of baseball. Yes.
I want to talk, of course, about the whole history of stadiums, but I think an interesting point about that early time was the concurrent development with cemeteries and with parks. Can you talk sort of?
One of the things that I talk about in the book that I think actually had not been discussed before by anybody is that I'm trying to position the ballpark as it's kind of the third leg in a stool, the third element in the efforts in the 19th century as America was rapidly becoming urbanized. And I should say, to digress a tiny bit, never mind all this Field of Dreams crap. Baseball was a city game as much as basketball has ever been the city game. And it was played where they could find room, kind of on the outskirts. And as cities got more and more industrialized and more built up, it kind of got pushed out farther because it needed a lot of space. But anyway, as cities became more and more industrialized and more dense, if you were a working class person, you had no access to green, no access to the country, no access to anything other than, very dense, tight, slum-filled, tenement-filled streets. We romanticize them now, but in many ways they were not always so wonderful. And movements arose in the 19th century to try to mitigate this. One of them was, of course, the most important was the urban park movement and Frederick Law Olmsted, the creation of Central Park, and so forth. There was also what was called the rural cemetery movement, as churchyards were filling up and people were building bigger, more rural cemeteries on the outskirts of cities, and they became very popular places where people would go and have picnics on Sunday. They did not just go to visit the graves of the dead. Again, people without the means to travel would go there just to be in open space. The third element, I say in the book, of that was the ballpark, because that was also a place where you could see green and open space. It was different in that you were going to see an activity, but it also served that same purpose of exposing people who had no access to anything other than a very dense, harsh urban environment, some opportunity to kind of breathe and see something green.
Right. I hadn't read about sort of the split between American and national leagues and sort of the culture of those two stadiums.
Right.
In those very early years. What was it called? The American League was all rabble-rousers, is that?
Well, the early, something called the American Association, which was not the American League. It actually did not grow into the American League. It was called the American Association, and now we're getting into kind of the 1880s when baseball was really getting bigger still. The American Association was known informally as the Beer and Whiskey League, and it was very rambunctious, rabble-rousers. It was very candid in its willingness to see baseball as entertainment. Mm-hmm. There was a guy in St. Louis who I write about a lot in the book named Chris Von der Eye, a German immigrant and tavern owner who bought the St. Louis Browns because he thought this would be a great way to sell more beer. And he actually had a branch of his tavern out in the outfield and advertised the original Sportsman's Park as the Coney Island of the West. Now, what was kind of in competition with that was the National League, which in fact is the precursor of today's real National League. The National League was all about propriety in those early years. They thought this was disgusting, this was terrible. Baseball was supposed to be about, Victorian manliness and virtue, and none of this, getting drunk out in the field, or none of the patrons being drunk. The National League, in its early years, had two rules that were far more important than any rules on the field. The rules were no games on Sunday, because you're supposed to be in church, and no alcohol to be served. Well, we know how long either of those rules lasted, obviously. Ultimately, the National League took over the American Association, which fell apart largely because the various owners, I think, were no better at management, or maybe they were just drunk all the time. I don't know what it was, but the National League took them over. But in fact, the tide was turning, and the National League adopted most of the American Association's rules, or rather gave up its strictures, let's say. And then what we know now as the American League arose separately a little bit later.
Great. So that's one part of the origin story. I guess I'd like to pivot to the personal origin story of how you started this book, and then maybe also we could think about your first stadiums.
Sure. How did I start this book? Well, I did not get, I did not meet with Mickey Mantle in a hotel room on Christmas Day. I didn't have any kind of story of such drama as Jane Levy told us. I've always loved ballparks. I realized that and in fact, back in the years when I was at the New York Times, I would always find an excuse to, I wrote about Camden Yards when it was new. I wrote about, whenever there would be a new one, I would go and write an architecture piece about it. And the arts editor, I remember, didn't feel that it was all that significant, and why did I care so much? But the sports editor was always happy to have something different, so half of them ran in the sports section. And so it had always kind of been in the back of my head that there was a little more to it. And then when I was at the New Yorker, this is 11 years ago, 2009, when the new Yankee Stadium and new Citi Field opened, I was asked to write a piece by David Remnick for the magazine about them. And as I was researching it, I realized there was just so much amazing history, and that the history of ballparks really is American urban history. And that they were braided together in this really fascinating way that it touched on everything. It touched on the history of immigration. It touches on the history of urban planning. It touches and the ballpark effectively is a mirror for how we viewed American cities throughout our whole culture. The early ballparks were deeply integrated into cities, into neighborhoods. In the mid-20th century, they broke away and became these concrete donuts in the middle of a sea of parking, which mirrors the whole suburban exodus. Beginning with Camden Yards in Baltimore in 1992, they started to try to reintegrate into the city, which again mirrors so that you could tell the story of the American city through baseball, through ballparks. And I went to my publisher and said, what do you think about this idea? And I had just agreed to write a biography of Frank Gehry for Knopf. And they said, yes, do it, so long as you do the first book first.
Turn it in, yeah.
Turn in the first book first. Because actually, to go back to what was talked about in the last session, Gehry was at that point 80, I think. And nobody knew they did not want it to be a posthumous autobiography, rather. So they wanted me to move fast. So I finished that and then did this.
Right. And it's profoundly researched. Can you talk a little bit about your process for learning about these stadiums?
Sure.
And reviewing them as a critic?
Sure. Well, the first part of the book is really historical, of course, and that was more conventional research, just through all the documents and writings and stuff about early baseball and early urban history and so forth. When it transitions into places that are here now, I went to visit them all. I had aspired to be at every ballpark during a game. I'll be in the intimacy and privacy of this room, I will admit. I got to all of them, but did not get to all of them during a game. There were a couple I visited in the winter, and they were the teams were very cooperative, but not to the point of staging a game, so I could see how it was. But I tried as often as I could to be there when I could, and and I was blessed, as every writer doing a large, wide-ranging nonfiction book is, with some good assistance, both from some wonderful friends, one of whom, Pam Flaherty, is in the audience today, who came with me to a couple of them and had important insights, and other, just people helping dig up facts and stuff.
Yeah. What was the best game you saw on that grand tour?
The best game I saw, it's interesting, actually. The games I remember best, maybe it's because I was trying so hard to focus on the ballparks during the period of working on this. The games I sort of remember best in my head generally are not games. I did not see any truly great games during the research period of this. Except
no-hitters.
No-hitters, nothing like that. No. I was actually, it's funny, actually.
I was wondering about that, thinking about the architecture as you visit.
Right.
We've read about the stadiums. We know, what's in Baltimore, what's in Seattle, what's in Texas. But as a fan and an architecture critic, walking up to a building you've never seen in real life before, can you talk about the experience of first taking in that monumental architecture?
Well, it depends upon which one it is and whether, look, there are also buildings like Tropicana in St. Petersburg, Tampa, which I had not seen till I was working on this, and which I discovered was every bit as bad as I thought it was. And it really is the most unpleasant. First, baseball should not be played indoors anyway.
Right.
And it's the last fixed dome stadium left. All the others are gone. There are several retractable roof ballparks in existence, which is better. Some are better than others. Seattle is the best of them because it was done really to protect from rain, not heat. So it's not climate controlled.
Right.
It's just more like the world's largest umbrella that slides over the
I'm
field.
from Seattle. We need it out there.
Yeah, you need that, right? Because right. The enemy there is rain, not extreme heat or extreme cold. So it's fine. And so it comes the closest to creating the illusion that it's not there when it's open. But the ones that where you really feel that you feel more like you're indoors are the least satisfying in every way. It's you can sort of understand that, or at least why they want to do it. In the early years of baseball, it was played in the Midwest and the Northeast, and not very much. Did not go west of St. Louis, and then a little later Kansas City. It was not played in the Deep South. So I don't really like having a roof on the ballpark in Houston or Miami or whatever, but at the same time, I don't really want to sit in the Florida sun for 3.5 hours either.
At least not in August.
At least not in August, right, exactly. And I was at, I went to Marlin Stadium, I remember one day in August, actually, and it was when they had it, they had the roof closed and the air conditioning on, and it's indoor. It's indoor. The Astrodome is, I think, one of the most remarkable, amazing, fascinating, and insane buildings of mid 20th century America, but it was a terrible place for baseball.
Right. Did you see any games in there?
Never saw a game there. No. I had been there, but I'd never seen a game there. And when I went to Houston more recently, it was gone. It is still there, but the Astros had, of course, moved on.
Right.
To the briefly named Enron Field, now Minute Maid Stadium. Yes.
Let's talk more about the ballparks of Texas, because I think there's been some interesting movement there.
Yeah.
Can you talk about the Rangers and what they've decided to do?
Sure. I think it's really too bad. The Rangers built in 1994 what was originally called the ballpark at Arlington, and then became Globe Life Park or whatever. It's only 25 years old, and in fact, they are tearing it down and replacing it because they want a roof. And adding a roof to it turned out not to be practical. So they say the original architect of it I've spoken to, he insists it was, and is quite resentful of the fact. I mean, it was a funny ballpark because it was, Camden Yards, which is the most important ballpark of our time still. I think it's not the very best, but it's almost the best, and it's certainly the most important because it's the only time in any architecture at all that the whole paradigm just changed, turned 180 degrees because of one structure. And it brought us back to traditional baseball-only ballparks that are integrated into neighborhoods. It was criticized for being a little bit cutesy and a little bit retro, which indeed it is. The ballpark at Arlington took the historical aspect of it and ramped it up. It's the only one that became even more Disney-like. But it's not bad, and it tried very hard, and I think had a certain earnestness that I liked about it. And in any case, it's a shame it is going after 25 years for something. I think it's going to be just bigger and more conventional, actually. But, that whole area around Arlington, Texas has become this kind of new little entertainment center that's separate from a city, which is a whole other trend now that we see most clearly in Atlanta, which that kind of ends the book with the most troubling thing about, everything seemed very optimistic after Camden Yards, and everyone was building, again, traditional ballparks. We got rid of the myth of the multi-sport stadium, which is bad for football and bad for baseball. You can't really, any more than you can do like a great opera house that also has symphony and ballet. Right. It's going to compromise everything somewhat. Similarly, you can't do a great baseball park and have football in it, or vice versa, because the needs are too different. But anyway, Atlanta is baseball only, but they moved way out of the city, and they built a whole, essentially, theme park city around it. 15 miles away from downtown at the intersection of two freeways, and it's really weird. And very sad in a way, because it's an admission that baseball and urban context fit together, and people like the idea of walking to a ballpark. But instead of having it integrated into the real city, what they did was go way out, build the ballpark, and then build a pretend make-believe city that you can kind of park your car and walk around in. So it's a little bit of like, I don't know if anyone's ever been to like City Walk at Universal in Hollywood or something, one of those sort of pretend mall-type fake cities. But it has a hotel, it has an office building, it even has condos. It has a condo building that has the disingenuous name of home. And there it is. I don't know, But there's another thing, excuse me, one more point about Atlanta that is truly, seriously troubling about it in a much more profound way. It's in Cobb County, which is the only county in metropolitan Atlanta that is not part of the regional transit system. If you are a young person of color, or indeed or of limited means, whatever your background is, in the city, and you don't have a car, you can't go to the baseball game anymore. They have effectively said, our audience is upper middle class, white, suburban Atlantans, and we're going to build for them where they live. And that's what they did. I think it's not an accident that the city in America in which professional soccer has now become the most successful is Atlanta, because the team is based downtown, and they have taken up a lot of the audience that the Braves effectively tossed aside by moving there. So that's another reminder, though, that that baseball sort of connects to everything and tells you about everything as cities evolve. But in this case, though, not so positive.
Right. I thought, the book sort of marches along in a historic
Right.
way, and as someone familiar with the evolution of urban policy and the culture of cities, but not necessarily having tracked all the stadiums, it does graph on in such a compelling way. Do you think Atlanta is that an outlier, or is that the new direction?
Well, I want it to be an outlier.
Yeah.
I hope nobody else does that. Although, of course, Texas sort of did it in a more limited way years ago when they put the ballpark in Arlington, and now that's growing into something bigger as a kind of entertainment node of its own. But Texas is Texas, whatever. I mean, it's too bad because, in fact, Dallas would have been very amenable to a ballpark in the city. It would have worked very well, just the way Denver. Coors is one of my favorite ballparks, and it really integrates beautifully into the older section of Denver. What's happening, the aspect of Atlanta that is not an outlier is not the moving to the suburbs part. It's the part of it in which the team is saying, we want to control the world outside our gates, not just inside our gates. We want to make money, not just from selling people expensive beer and hot dogs. We also want to make as much money as we can from them in the area outside the ticketed area. And, the thing about Atlanta is that the Braves own that whole development. What we're seeing is teams trying to do that even in more conventional urban areas. For example, in St. Louis, where the Cardinals built the new Busch Stadium across the street from the old Busch Stadium in a good central downtown location that I really like very much. After using the old one for parking for a while, they've now begun to develop the old site as something they call Ballpark Village, which has a little St. Louis Cardinals museum. It has bars, restaurants. It will have condo towers, so you can live at the, other stuff. At the end of the day, I don't think that's so terrible. That land should be developed anyway. If it's developed in a way that integrates with the ballpark, it's probably a little bit blander and more corporate than it otherwise would have been. But it's not the end of the world. And, whatever. I'm willing to make a peace with that. Similarly, in Chicago, the current ownership of the Chicago Cubs has done a pretty good job of restoring Wrigley Field. There are a few details that some people, including me, feel might have been a little less so, and I'm not thrilled with digital scoreboards there, although the original one is still there, and most of the feeling that made Wrigley Field so magical is still intact. But they, too, are aggressively buying up a lot of the surroundings, and they've built a hotel across the street. They built an office building for the team. And Wrigleyville is gradually becoming less funky, less raunchy, a little more like a generic, modern neighborhood. Again, this is not terrible, and I think the world has far worse problems to deal with than that. So, and it's okay. And the fact that the thing at its heart, the ballpark itself, was not torn down but was restored mostly well. On balance, we all came out ahead, so it's fine. So that what we're seeing is the Atlanta model playing out in real urban environments, which I think we can all live with and is fine. It's the picking up and moving the entire thing to a make-believe city in the middle of nowhere that I don't like.
That's fair. You just talked about Wrigley. Can you talk a little bit more about old stadiums? Of course, Fenway Park is still in operation, but... Fenway
and Wrigley, there's a short discussion there, too. They are both, incomparably wonderful. Actually, the most fun I had in the entire research period of this book was I had been to both Fenway and Wrigley, but not in a few years, and I wanted to revisit them both both to freshen my memory of them and also to see, because in both cases they had been renovated and brought up to date somewhat in ways that aspired to not screw up the original feeling of it. And I wanted to see them close together. So I looked in the calendar and I found one point in the summer, I think it was like July 31st and August 1st, when they had back-to-back home games. So flew to Boston, went to Fenway, and then the next morning flew to Chicago and went. So I saw them 24 hours apart. That was really wonderful. That was a lot more fun than going to Tropicana in St. Petersburg. I can assure you. They are great experiences. They are great partly because they are resonant with history and rich with history, but also because they're intimate. Scale is so important in baseball. One of the most important things done at Camden Yards, besides the fact that it is consciously and intentionally asymmetrical and has a certain amount of historical detail, is that it was built with, I think, 46 or 47,000 seats, since reduced a little bit further, at a time when everybody was building over 50,000. And there's a point in the same way that there's a kind of sweet spot for concert halls, which is sort of around 2,300. And when you get over 2,500, it's weird, something is lost. You wouldn't think, it's only 10% more, but just you lose something. It's the same with baseball. And in fact, I think that's the reason that probably the very best ballpark of the post-Camden Yards era is PNC in Pittsburgh, which is actually the smallest. It's under 40, I think it's 38, 39,000, something like that. Intimacy is incredibly important, and sight lines, and a sense of connection. The most memorable observation that I've ever read about what is now called guaranteed rate field, but which I will prefer to call New Comiskey Park in Chicago, which is a horrible thing. It's the last of the concrete donuts. It was built, it opened 1 year before.
Wait, there's only one left?
No, it's the last to be built.
Okay.
It's the youngest of the concrete donuts. No, there are a few others.
Should we be so lucky?
It's the youngest of the concrete donuts. It was opened in '91, only 1 year before Camden Yards. It's horrible. But John Pasteur, who's a wonderful architecture writer who's also quite interested in baseball, wrote that it had the size of it, the scale of it was so big that the front row in the upper deck was farther from the field than the last row of the upper deck in the old Comiskey that it replaced. I mean, everything just gets pushed back. Some of that is, just to make more room for clubs and fancy dining and this and that and boxes and skyboxes and all that stuff, as well as bigger backstage and locker room facilities and all that stuff. Everything kind of balloons out. The footprint becomes much bigger. The old ballparks were little. Now, some of that makes it wonderful when you're in your seat and close to the action. It also means, however, that there's not, amenities are very limited in a lot of ways. In the same way that you go to one of those wonderful 1920s Broadway theaters, they have bathrooms that are smaller than this rug here, and lobbies that are, no bigger than this rug. They didn't seem to be big on that stuff in those days. And so I guess people didn't go to the bathroom in the terms. I don't know what they did, but it sort of, everything was very tight and very limited. Trying to figure out how to balance that is a really difficult challenge because people today insist on and have a perfect right to a level of amenity that was not acceptable in 1914 when the original Wrigley Field was built, for example, or in 1912 when Fenway opened. So.
You talk about smaller stadiums. This is a bit outside the purview of the book, but I wonder if you can talk about attendance to baseball and
Sure.
and
No,
that.
it's not really outside. I mean, yes, it's outside the purview, and I don't deal with it, but it's a reasonable thing to talk
Yeah.
about. Attendance. Well, I'm never going to try to claim that good architecture will make a team win a game. Certainly the Baltimore Orioles in the last couple of years are proof of that. But it does bring people because they have a better experience. I mean, Progressive Field in Cleveland, which is one of the, I think, excellent of the new generation of ballparks, for a period, I think it was, I forget the number, it was 415 consecutive sold-out games, something, it's in the book, actually,
Right.
something like that, yeah. So there is no question it does. And conversely, I remember they showed me when I toured Tropicana, how they have effectively closed off the top layer, the top deck rather, because nobody goes there anymore, and it didn't make sense to even, again, it shows you the dangers of an indoor ballpark. It cost too much to air condition the space when nobody was up there. So they've kind of compressed it, like when you bring everyone down front in an auditorium when there are not that many people or something. Of course, behind that, architecture alone is not going to change attendance. There's also the larger question of baseball in general and its role in the culture, and the fact that it does struggle for attendance. There are a lot of people who think that this is because baseball moves more slowly, which it does, and we live in an age when everyone has a short attention span. There is some truth to that. It's not the whole answer. People certainly show up when the game is played well, when a lot is at stake, when big stars are there, all sorts of things do bring people there. What I think does not bring people there is rock music so loud that you can't talk to the person next to you, as the last time I was at Citi Field I experienced. It's important to remember that when baseball became the preeminent American sport and the so-called America's pastime, as somebody said, there were no other professional sports. Not team sports. I mean, yes, there was boxing, and that was sort of growing, and there was this and that, but professional football is a 20th century invention and did not grow really big until the age of television, because football is actually a sport far more amenable to television than baseball. Mm-hmm. Basketball was not even invented until just before the beginning of the 20th century, and again did not grow really big until the middle of the 20th century. Hockey is of our time almost in terms of being a major sport. Mm-hmm. Soccer is newer still in terms of being at the forefront of American culture and occupying a big role. So, I think the issue baseball faces, in a way, it's more like sort of, look at the legitimate theater on Broadway. It survives, but it now survives not as the one form of entertainment in public, but in competition with film, television, and a million other electronic media today. And of course, it's going to be harder. Mm-hmm. I think it will not disappear. It will find itself, and it is finding itself. This is now about to get much farther away from the book, but there's a lot of talk about changes in the game to speed it up.
Yeah,
I know.
Pitch clock.
Right. The pitch clock. There's talk about tiebreakers. There's talk about 7 innings instead of 9 innings. There's talk about a lot of stuff. I think there's something just so beautiful about the fact that baseball is not played against the clock, that to bring a clock into it would destroy something very fundamental about it. A pitch clock is different. A pitch clock is you can have a pitch clock without a game clock, so it's all right.
Right.
So,
Speaking of clocks, I got the signal that we
okay.
have a few minutes left, so I wanted to open it up for questions. There's folks with mics coming around.
I love your book.
Oh, thank you. Thank you.
Would you expand on the socioeconomic divide in the early stadiums where, like, wicker chairs and
Sure.
the posh thing of that demographic, and how the other demographic was segregated, which
Yep.
I think only exists maybe in Fenway still, where bleachers seats can't get into the grandstand.
Right. I'm not sure even that still exists in Fenway, that's a really important part of the story that the book is telling. Again, as baseball reflects the evolution of the American city in so many ways, it does, particularly in terms of class distinctions. We think the skybox is an invention of our time. The only part of the skybox that's an invention of our time is the part where you can sit in it and watch the game on television and never look at the real thing out there. In fact, many of the early ballparks were rigidly segregated in terms of admission price. And as you've just said, you're absolutely right. In most of them, the bleachers were entirely separate, with a separate entrance and a separate bathrooms and stuff like that, and you could not circulate where the higher price seats were. Lest we think, though, that this is only something done in ballparks, I don't know if anyone here remembers the old Metropolitan Opera House on 39th Street in New York. The highest balcony, which was called the Family Circle, had a separate entrance on the street and a small lobby and a staircase that went all the way up so that the poor people did not mix with the fancy people on the other levels. So it was, in fact, there was a presumed economic segregation that was, while it did not happen everywhere, it happened often enough in enough places so that it seemed to be taken as a matter of course for a long time in a lot of American culture. Because in fact, the Metropolitan Opera House was built, I think, in 1883, which would coincide with early years as baseball was growing and some of those very early wooden ballparks. We talk about the whole generation of the wooden ballparks.
Yeah, watch out for
were
those.
coming, right, were coming up, and they were where a lot of these patterns were first set around the same time. Yes, sir. Okay.
Okay, so I just don't know whether you've had a chance to visit Nationals Park in Washington, but I'd like to get your thoughts about it.
I have visited Nationals Park. I like it on the outside in that it is. I sort of like the way when you go down South Capitol Street, it's kind of fits in with the neighborhood in a way that it's very modern, but in a way that is a modern echo of the way a lot of the traditional ballparks did. That's what I like best about it. When you're in it, it's kind of bland. It does fit well into this developing neighborhood, and it seems to be the only, or one of the only ballparks that has truly fulfilled the promise always made that this is going to stimulate lots of development. And so that neighborhood is developing wonderfully. I find the ballpark itself to be sadly banal as a place, however. Actually, Jane Levy and I were talking about this the other night. I said, well, at least it's better than RFK Stadium. And she said, no, it isn't. So whatever, but I will absolutely agree, it's bland. While I hate the concrete donuts with such a passion, I'm willing to say it's better than RFK Stadium was. Nevertheless, the best things about it are as you walk around it on the outside. Also, the parking garages are a little more prominent than you want them to be as part of the design and so forth. So it's a mixed bag. It sure is not PNC Park by any stretch of the imagination, or Denver, or San Diego, Petco. To anticipate what might be the next question, I think my favorite of the newer generation are Pittsburgh, San Diego, San Francisco, Denver, and of course Baltimore. That group, I think, are the best.
Is the football stadium becoming the real mark of the American city?
Is the football stadium becoming the real mark of the American city? I sure hope not. And I say that for a couple of reasons. One is a football stadium, of course, is much, much bigger. They don't really fit well into cities. It's why the idea of putting a football stadium on the site that is now Hudson Yards on the west side of Manhattan was a big mistake, although if they'd put a baseball park there, it would have been wonderful, I think. And it's too bad they missed that chance. Football, it's bigger. It has many more seats. It has a much bigger footprint. That's one reason. The other is that, tailgating is a key part of the culture of football, for better or for worse. You may not like it or want it, but it is what it is, which makes it much harder. So huge, sprawling parking lots, horrible as they are really part of the culture of the experience for people, and that's utterly anti-urban. So it's very, very tough to make that work with a city. Whereas again, baseball fits into an urban fabric very beautifully and very naturally.
We have time for one more question.
You haven't said, here I am, you haven't said anything about the architects who really are doing some of the more current work on baseball fields. Any thoughts on who some of the best are at doing that?
Right. There is a lot of discussion in the book. We haven't in this conversation, but the book is full of that. There's a firm that has done most of them that is based in Kansas City, has the odd name of Populous. They are an interesting and funny story. They were a spin-off from a gargantuan mega firm. They were the sports department, which then went off on their own. And they pride themselves on, well, let me put it this way. They designed a lot of the concrete donuts for a long time. They also designed Camden Yards, because the owners of the Orioles were an unusually enlightened client. They did not want that. They wanted something else and pushed their architects harder and harder until they got it. The former owner of the Baltimore Orioles once told me that he thinks, I don't know if he meant this sarcastically or seriously, he thinks that the New Comiskey Park in Chicago is the plan that he rejected for Camden Yards, and that they then ran quickly before anybody knew what was going on and sold it to Chicago before Camden Yards got built. So they then learned really fast, and like a convert who becomes more religious than anyone else, immediately marketed themselves as the creators of the new kind of baseball park, and have done several of the best, including several of the ones I mentioned, like PNC and
Did they do Petco?
They did Petco in partnership with Antoine Predock, who's a really interesting Southwestern architect who was brought in to collaborate. There are not a lot of instances of architects from the rest of the world doing ballparks. I've never known how much of that is whether clients, which is to say the teams, are not enlightened enough to want somebody else, or whether they're just convinced by the hype that there's too much stuff that only they know, like secret sauce and so
Right.
forth.
I think it's
and
sort of like designing hospitals.
It's
where
very much like
there's-
designing hospitals.
Like there's just so many very specific things that need to
right,
happen when
but
you get 40,000 people.
we've
together.
often found that partnerships can be made where somebody with a better aesthetic sense comes in and says, okay, you guys can tell me where the operating rooms have to be and how to organize this stuff, but I'm going to. I think we did see an attempt at that in San Diego with Antoine Predock brought in. There have been a couple of others, not always super successful. And then there's one that I find very promising that I hope goes ahead. It's the most interesting new project around right now, which is Oakland, where it's discussed at the end of the book. The Oakland A's have hired Bjarke Ingels Group, BIG, it's called, that big Danish-based, but now mainly New York-based firm, which has to do a new ballpark at Howard Terminal on the waterfront, right on the edge of downtown. And they, too, want to develop a lot of land around it, but they want to make it really, truly urban. He has some interesting ideas for how to make the ballpark itself a little different and yet still work. I think it's the most promising new one, and it's a good example of the point you're raising, which is bringing in a different architect. Let's see how it plays out.
Great. Thank you so much.
Thank you all very much.